Hi, everyone. I thank you for being here today. As Bara mentioned, we're going to be talking now about decolonization at work, centering justice over optics in corporate activism. Right? But before I jump right in, I want to ask you, what do you understand by the term decolonization? If you wish to unmute, you can do so, or you can just write what you think in the chat. What comes to mind when you hear the word decolonization?
I'm going to be funny now. Give me a second to think about it, Mahmoud. Ha
Okay.
ha.
Let's see. Give it another minute. I think people are writing down their answers. Okay. Decolonization, coming back from the mental model of superiority. Apologize, this basic definition. That's actually quite good. And of course, reverse the colonization process and give freedom. Okay, perfect. Any other thoughts?
I love it. Tobias just said, wait. I'm finishing. Enter. Here he goes.
So we have awareness of the colonial past in our present, actively address the colonial structures, etc. Yes. Following a Western model of thinking and organizing. Okay. So let me share my screen and we're going to jump right into it. So can you see my screen? Yes.
It is coming. It is there.
Okay, perfect. So a little bit about me. My name is Mahmoud Assy. I'm from Egypt. I live in Madrid, in Spain, and I work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and trainer. I also participate in a lot of the different collectives on decolonial work. We do a lot of strategic movements to push basically for more inclusive policies on an EU level, on a local level, and through different actions. And I wanted to talk a lot about this topic in particular because I feel that there is a lot of, or not enough spaces where we talk about the importance of working on corporate activism, specifically when it comes to decolonial work. But let's first understand these concepts. First of all, we can start with understanding the concept of coloniality and of colonization. So when we talk about colonization, we're referring to the historical process where dominant powers impose control over other regions, exploiting resources and people, right? So it's the process that we learn about historically speaking. Coloniality, on the other hand, is a term that was coined by a Peruvian sociologist called Aníbal Quijano, who basically used it to refer to how the systems, the structures that we have in today's world are a direct result of these structures of colonization. In other words, it's to show that colonization never really went away. We can still see that the countries that were used for extracting materials, for extracting labor, etc., are still in a position of less power in the global system that we have today. So it's showing these global systemic inequalities and why they arise. And we need to think about these inequalities not just from a perspective of who has, for example, economic power, but we're talking about also like learning, like whose knowledge is deemed as legit, whose knowledge is not deemed as legit, whose culture is deemed as worthy, what narratives are we hearing about different peoples, etc., like cultures, etc. There's a lot of hierarchies as a system of colonization produced and is still maintained today in the system of coloniality, right? So when we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about the process of dismantling colonial systems, structures, and ways of thinking, both in political institutions and in cultural, economic, and social practices. And in the workplace, this means challenging power imbalances centering marginalized voices, and transforming practices that perpetuate inequality. And it's very important for us to talk about decolonization in the workplace, because when we're talking about corporations actually play a major role in the systems of power, the structures of power, and specifically in the power imbalances that exist in today's world. So we need to understand what can we do, especially being employees working within these corporations. What can we do to challenge these power imbalances, to center the marginalized, and to produce a global system that is based on justice in that sense? So there are many reasons why this is very important, like why this and why now. We can see war and genocide and climate crisis happening in different parts of the world. We're seeing what's happening in Gaza, it's happening in the Congo, and we're talking about as well deforestation that's happening in the Amazon. And a lot of different things are happening, and they're pushed from this idea of profit as the unique and only goal of corporations, right? Which is a core idea that is still pushed up until today and still is not sufficiently challenged in today's world. We're seeing global inequality and exclusion. Like we see, like workplace power remains concentrated in the global north and among dominant groups, even within the global north. So inclusion is often symbolic, not structural. We're seeing it a lot of the time as a reaction to something, and as opposed to it being a core design or redesigning of the structures that we have. We see exploitative supply chain, like as mentioned at the beginning, the Congo, for example, is a major example of this. Global markets still depend as well on cheap labor and resources from formerly colonized regions, and a lot of the times not caring for the impact that their practices are having on local communities, right? So colonial extraction did not end. It just is rebranded as cheap labor somewhere else, right? And we're seeing also a lot of optics over true accountability. When we're talking about diversity, sustainability efforts, they're most of the time performatives. And we're going to show you some data actually that to highlight this. But we're seeing that justice becomes more of a PR action as opposed to a true transformation. So all of this positions us in a point where we need to take action. We need to realize the power that we have within the systems that we operate in, and understand what can we do. So to give you a bit of a clearer example, there is, for example, a lot of performative activism. When we look at corporations, for example, we can see that there is 23% of corporations that they claim climate advocacy, right? While they are part of industry associations, where only 12% of these industry associations are actually aligned with climate actions. So you can see big companies, big corporations coming out and saying that they support, for example, the Paris Agreement. And then you look and you're seeing that they're part of industry associations that are lobbying in the EU to actually push back on climate action. Something that is currently happening in Europe, and actually they're gaining a lot of traction. And actually we're seeing comebacks, like pushback on different actions in the name of economic progress, right? So this is very important because despite public commitments, some companies fund and are members of industry associations that lobby against strengthening this climate action. And this diversion reflects either the disproportionate influence of less ambitious members within associations, or a strategic move by companies to avoid public backlash while opposing green regulations via these groups. But something here that is very important, and it's clear for and it's important for us to understand, is that a lot of people within companies do not even know that, in the sense of you might be working in a corporation and you're seeing these public statements that they're doing about the importance of working, doing climate actions, reducing, their carbon footprint and whatnot. But you don't know that this corporation at the same time is part of this industry association, or is doing directly or indirectly lobbying to actually reduce or push back on these climate actions in that sense, right? So one of the major elements that we're seeing here is the importance of information, of understanding what is going on, what is truly going on beyond the performance, right? And when we're talking about this, we're seeing that a lot of the time, this information might be more within the corporation, hidden within the corporation than outside, right? So this again puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of having this insider activism, as opposed to waiting from people from the outside to realize what's going on. And also the importance of this insider activism to push for more transparency of these organizations. And it's not only related to climate. When we're talking about justice, for example, we're seeing a huge shift from justice to justification. When we're talking about, for example, DEI, we're seeing that 3 in 4 Fortune 500 companies use or justify workforce diversity, like DEI work, using the business case, which is something that is very important for us to highlight, because when we're justifying the work that we're doing for DEI with purely economic standards, we forget that the work that we're doing is actually social justice work. We're not doing it because it gains us more profit. We're doing it because it is the right thing to do, because otherwise we're actively creating a system of discrimination in the societies that we're in, right? And we can see how this can go very wrong, specifically nowadays with the case of the US, right? So it is very important for us to understand this. Why are we using certain modes, certain justifications for things that should be inherently within? And this goes back to something I mentioned at the beginning, which is that there's still this core belief that their sole purpose of corporations is to generate profit, which is something that rose in the 70s and 80s, actually started in the US, right? But it is important for us to realize that actually companies didn't used to just focus on, well, shareholder profit. They actually cared for they responded to the different stakeholders, including, for example, workers' unions. Now we're seeing unions are in incredible decline all over the world, right? So it's important for us to realize all of this. And the reason, again, for this presentation for me is to realize that it's important to take back power and understand what role we can play within that system. So employees possess unique insights in corporate practices and can identify discrepancies between stated values and actions, again, because they're inside. Internal advocacy can lead to policy change, ethical realignment, and increased transparency. So all of this, what I shared, can generate a lot of different things, right? Like they reflect, for example, like the importance of this work, but a lot of employees might think, okay, but what exactly can I do, right? What actions can I choose? And I want to clarify, yes, nowadays, like the term global north and global south, we're moving towards terms like global majority and global minority, for example, and to reflect the reality of the world, actually, in that sense. So thank you for highlighting this. So what does employee activism, can it look like? In a study done by Forrest Briscoe and Pibanav Gupta, who are organizational analysts, scholars, sorry, that what they found is that usually employees are moved to action or activism in 3 major areas. We're seeing workplace CSR, environment CSR, and supplier and customer CSR. CSR, corporate social responsibility. So when we're talking about workplace CSR, we're talking about, for example, aspects like gender pay equity, LGBTQ+ rights, discrimination, sexual harassment, inequality, and board diversity. We're talking about the environment. We're talking about the carbon footprint, recycling, or local pollution. When we're talking about supplier or customer CSR, we're talking about working conditions, living wages, unethical use of product or services, support for authoritarian governments, use for products or services to violate civil rights, and child labor. So these are the major areas where we're seeing that employees are mobilizing. And I don't want to leave it in the general, so I'm giving you some case studies. For example, in 2017, Google signed a contract with the US Department of Defense for Project Maven. Project Maven, basically, its goal was to use AI to analyze drone footage improving military surveillance. Employees discovered the project was being used for warfare, and they decided to take action. So what we saw is that over 4,000 employees signed a letter demanding the cancellation of the contract, stating like, we believe that Google should not be in the business of war, and at least 12 employees resigned in protest. And internal forums and media were used to increase pressure. The result? Google did not renew the Project Maven contract when it expired, and the company published AI principles committing not to develop AI for use in weapons or surveillance that violates international norms. Sorry. We can see this, for example, in Shopify. And the case, for example, of indigenous entrepreneurship in Canada. So employees at Shopify in Canada advocated for increased support for indigenous communities. This internal push led to the establishment of partnerships aimed at empowering indigenous entrepreneurs. This was pushed by creating the Build Native program to reduce barriers for indigenous entrepreneurs, advocated internally through an ERG-led event, discussions, and direct proposals to leadership. So this is a case that is very interesting as well. How can we use the ERGs that we're creating in different corporations to move towards more activism and push for specific actions by the corporations that we're working in? So the result was that Shopify partnered with organizations such as Powwow Pitch to provide resources and platform for indigenous entrepreneurs, and initiatives included mentorship programs, funding opportunities, and tools to help indigenous businesses establish an online presence. For the sake of time, I'm going to move a bit faster, and I want us to also not just think that any sort of activism is going to have positive impact. Employee activism can lead to powerful change, but it's important to remember that speaking up, especially on urgent human rights issues, often comes at a cost, even when you're standing up for the right thing. The path is not always easy or safe. Still, raising your voice matters because silence maintains the status quo. And we can see this in different cases specifically related to Palestine. For example, Microsoft Azure Cloud services are reportedly used by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So in April 2025, employee Ibtihal Abu Saad disrupted Microsoft's 50th anniversary event, accusing the company of aiding in human rights abuses. In May 2025, engineer Joe Lopez interrupted CEO Satya Nadella's keynote at the Build conference, protesting Microsoft's contracts with Israel. Both employees sent internal communications urging colleagues to oppose the company's involvement with the Israeli military. But the outcome? Microsoft conducted an internal review stating no evidence of misuse of its technology, and employees involved in protests faced disciplinary action, including terminations. We can see this also in Google. In April 2024, employees protested the company's $1.2 billion cloud computing contract with the Israeli government, known as Project Nebius. What the employees did, they organized sit-ins, protests at Google offices, and participated in No Tech for Apartheid campaign, demanding the company end its involvement in Project Nebius. The outcome, Google terminated 28 employees involved in protests, citing violations of company policies. The company's actions sparked debates about the limits of employee activism and corporate responsibility. So again, it is not always, you don't always get the outcomes that you want. And this leads us to the importance of being very strategic, right? We need to ask what can be done, who can do it, when, and how. And I want to give you a little bit of insight on this. There are different studies that analyze this, but we can basically divide or arrange or map the different actions that could be done by employee activists on two different axes. One axis goes from innovative to established. Another goes from disruptive to persuasive. So the more innovative actions, for example, can include shareholder resolution from stockholding employees. Some companies, for example, give different stocks to their employees. If you group enough people with stocks from the employees, you can mobilize or lead certain discussions in the organizations. Other more established forms, for example, are employee walkouts, when employees walk out of a certain workday or out of the offices, right? A persuasive element is when I try to persuade basically the leadership of the company to do certain actions in that sense, right? Like coordination with activists in peer companies or dissemination of info on company intranet. So I'm trying to persuade more of the employee bulk to, well, to join me on certain elements. Disruptive action is more action that disrupts the company. So this can be, for example, provisions of internal info to external NGOs. So I might share some of the info to NGOs that are working on a certain topic. Unsanctioned employee poll data collection. So I can create a data poll, for example, to learn more about what's going on in the company. There are cases, for example, where employees did such an internal unofficial survey to showcase that there is racism and sexism happening in the company, and this led to actually multiple managers that were involved in these the acts of discrimination to get replaced, basically. So we can see different lines of action that can be done, right? We can decide how to do these actions based on where we are. So we can be either insiders.
Before you jump into this, let me briefly be kindly so interrupt you. This is the last minute. We have one question in chat. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, just like I'm going to go through this very quickly, like we need to be very tactical with what exactly is like where we are and how we want to lead to how we want to get to the outcome that we're in, right? So if we're seeing that leadership is not receptive, we can try, is receptive, we can lead with persuasive tactics, lead discussions, find more alliances, people that can lead the conversation. If we're seeing that leadership is hostile or the issue is controversial, we might use more disruptive tactics. If we are a credible voice in the organization, we might lead with more, again, persuasive action, or leading with more, creating more coalition and leading with creating a movement inside the organization. If we have low credibility, we need to find more alliances, see who is already working on this, maybe create an ERG, maybe find different tactics to lead for the change that we want to do. So unfortunately, we don't have time, so I'm going to stop here.